Hi everyone and welcome to week 2 of this short course. We've been getting some fantastic feedback online so far from all of you, and it's great to hear that. So please do share your thoughts, your experiences so far with us, and make sure to tag us in those conversations as well. And if you do have any questions, of course you can also contact us via email. All of that information is available in the additional resources tab just at the bottom of this page. Now, what we're going to be doing in this section is actually exploring the advertising and audiences section of Google Analytics. So what's all that about then, Rachel?
So 2 sections to cover, but kind of link quite well together, I would think. So in terms of the audiences, we learn a bit more around what functionality exists, quite different to what we've seen in the old world. So I think it's interesting to see what you can do. And also you see a lot of AI come through there. So machine learning, how do you use artificial intelligence to build audiences, become predictive, that sort of thing. So quite advanced. But also, obviously, the key thing is those audiences, how do you utilize them, not just inside Google Analytics, but outside of the platform as well. And then from the advertising perspective, that's taken that data or that one step further. It's starting to understand the nuances, again, of the machine learning that Google Analytics 4 does, so that modeled versus observed conversions, but then also understanding how channels work together. And I think that's why it's a bit of a deeper analysis, because you're starting to understand the impact one thing has on another. It's not so much the one-dimensional or the two-dimensional walkthroughs that we've kind of went through so far. So lots to unpack here, but it's quite an interesting part of it as well. In this session, we're going to be covering 2 sections of Google Analytics 4. We're going to be covering the advertisement and reporting section, and then also audiences, as these are 2 smaller elements, but equally have great importance. The advertising snapshot report lets you quickly check business metrics and then dig deeper into the areas you want to explore. Each summary card addresses a single question about your business. For example, what channels drive the most conversions? What touch points do customers take to convert? And then if you click the sort of call to action at the bottom of each scorecard, that lets you dive in to see a more comprehensive set of data about that question. I think what's really important to note here is that this type of reporting is great for beginning to understand how your channels work together to get the most out of your marketing budget, and then also how to evaluate your performance with different attribution models. That's kind of a common problem that we face in digital marketing. To understand this section a little bit better, there's a few things that we need to cover. So there is a new feature in Google Analytics 4 all about conversion modeling. What this means is that Google can choose to model users who opt out of your cookie policy to try and give you that overall website performance view. Due to changes in privacy over the recent years, more and more users are choosing to opt out of cookies and want privacy away from companies gathering their data. So Google have used machine learning to model the conversions to try and predict those online conversions that aren't allowed to be observed directly, where the user has removed consent. In reports, the number of conversions will include both the modeled and the observed conversion volumes. It's really important to know this because when you're comparing across platform, the numbers might be different, and also you can choose to not do conversion modeling. There's an element within settings where you can turn that off if you wish to do so. The reason that conversion modeling holds some importance is because it then allows the ability to tie conversions to your ads or to your digital activity. Otherwise, the channels will continue to decrease, and therefore, when you're looking at Google Analytics 4 on face value, you might say, actually, no, it's not worth spending any more on this channel, which might not be the case at all. And then there's one thing to note, that all of this attributed conversion data for each channel can still be updated up to 7 days after the conversion has been recorded. So it's quite important that if we're doing some short-term analysis, you need to take those things into consideration. And the last thing that's probably worth noting before we kind of look into these reports is about the difference in attribution models. through the likes of paid marketing, whether that be search or social, people will be quite familiar with the idea that different channels, different platforms have different conversion models. And in general, Google Analytics 4 has what they call a cross-channel data-driven conversion model, whereas in the old world of Google Analytics, this solely used to be running on a last non-direct click model. And so that's quite a big shift in the platform, but also brings Google Analytics 4 more aligned to kind of the paid activity out there that is seen across the likes of Meta and Google Ads already. And then it's important to know, well, what does that actually mean? So an attribution model is a machine learning model that evaluates end-to-end journey of the conversion to deliver credit that is totally customized based on your account's historical data to each conversion that it receives. So for example, some popular attribution models that you will be aware of are something like last click, where the conversion actually happens at the end, that gets 100% of the credit. First click, it's just the first channel that the user visits your website on, gets all of the credit. Position based means that your start and your end channels get the most, but then each touch point in the middle gets a little bit of that. Linear is just that any touch point gets all exactly the same. Time decay is that the first channel gets the smallest amount and it gradually increases as the user comes back to convert. And then data driven is completely random based on that sort of machine learning algorithm to understand how each channel played a part in that journey. So now that we understand what data we would expect to see in these platforms, let's jump into the platform and take a look at some of the reports. So if you just start with all channels, it's quite a small report. It's really easy to get your head around, but ultimately it just gives you the channel performance, the amount of conversions, how much ad spend was alongside of those, but obviously that is going to be particularly Google Ads. Then your cost per conversion, your total revenue if applicable, and therefore return on ad spend. So it's just one table that gives you like top level everything you might need to know. And then really the only thing that is kind of important here is you can change your conversion events that you want to model this on. So for example, if I only wanted to look at purchases in this revenue example, that's how I would do so. Then if we go into the attribution section, there's two key reports. There's model comparison and conversion paths. So if we start with model comparison, model comparison lets you compare how different attribution models would attribute credit to the conversions across a range of different dimensions. It is really a useful tool to evaluate the impact of marketing activity that might be used at different stages of the funnel to help drive conversion. For example, what you might want to do is compare a last click model to a first click model to identify undervalued campaigns that are starting customers down the conversion path. This will be really helpful if you are wanting to evaluate where to drive more new customers to your website or mobile application. So for example, let's just start at the top. Make sure that I've just got my purchase filtered on here. This is just saying, do you want the reporting time frame to be the interaction time, so when they first interacted with the site, or the time that they converted, and conversion time is fantastic. And then if I just look at this on a channel by channel basis for a start, so the first we've got is last click, and then I'm using this grey drop down, I'm going to change this to first click. And what you can see here, for example, if we start to look at this data, in some instances, there's no change between the two models or the two amounts of revenue driven, or small and minimal change. As we get further down and we look at referral, it's a very different sort of story for referral and email. So for example, for referral, there's a lot more on the last click versus the first click. And the revenue differs as well. So it's about a 17% change for conversions, a 16% change for revenue. That could be because there might be some referrals, for example, like if you want to use cashback, if you want to go through a discount affiliate site. So that is quite interesting because that's where referral might come into play. And then for email, for example, what that's actually saying is that more email conversions start from a first touch. So email is the first touch point rather than the last touch point. So for example, if you're running a really effective email automation strategy that's working really well as getting users onto the website, but what maybe it's not doing is like capturing basket abandonment and saying, hey, you left this in your cart, here's a 10% discount, for example. So actually email is quite a good channel in terms of driving people initially to the site, but they wouldn't come back and convert through email. They might convert via a different channel. And that's how this report would work. And then obviously, based on the fact that it is now data driven versus last click, you can look at the two differences here, because what this is going to show you is almost like old world versus new world. And it will really allow you as businesses to begin to understand how that differs from maybe what you have been historically reporting on in the past. And then if we go on to conversion paths, conversion paths are really useful to see the typical journey a user takes to complete a conversion, but it really also helps to visualize the amount of credit that is given to each channel and then splits out what channel contributes the most and when. So again, always work your way down from top to bottom. I've got the right conversion path in place, and you can choose your path length. So is it all touch points, or do you want it to be greater than 2 touch points, for example? If you really want to look at how channels are working together, that's when you might specify that it might have to be 2 or more, for example, and you could apply that in place and see how the data differs. But for this instance right now, I'm just going to change this back to all touch points. And then basically we'll start with the first graph. So this is conversions grouped by channel. Again, you could change that down to be source, medium, campaign, whatever you feel like you need to analyze. And here you can pick your attribution model, data driven, last click, etc. And then it goes through early, mid and late touch points, and you can see it's given a proportion of the conversions. So for early touch points, that is about 11% of conversions, which is equivalent to 88.23 conversions. And then the first 25% of touch points in the path rounded to the nearest whole number. This segment is empty if the path only has 1 touch point. And then you can go and see, hover over and see how each channel gets its credit. And then you go into mid touch points. And again, this is the middle 50% of touch points in the path. And if the path has less than 3 touch points, that segment would be empty. So for example, it's not saying that paid search has done nothing. It's just that potentially if it features more in journeys with less than 3 touch points, for example. And then lastly, you go to your late touch points, which is that last 25%. If the path consists of just 1 touch point, this segment gets credited with the touch point. So you'll see that this proportion is quite high, but if we went on to and changed our filter to be greater than 2, you might see a very different set of figures here. But it's really useful for, again, trying to evaluate, okay, well, which activity is driving users to our website, but maybe necessarily doesn't have to include the conversion, and how does that progress along with their customer journey. And then as you go further down, you actually start to see what these common journeys look like. So you've got your channel grouping, you've got your volume of conversions, the purchase revenue, the average amount of days to convert, so the number of days from when the ad interaction happened until the conversion. And then lastly, the touch points to conversion. So the number of ad interactions it takes for a user to convert. And then what you'll see here is you've got this, there was 104 conversions where direct was the only touch point. They've had 1 interaction with the site and 100% of credit gets given to direct. That was equivalent of 405 conversions. Then the next most common is someone who came through organic search twice, and that happened 54 times, and therefore under this model organic search gets 100% of the conversions. If we started to scroll through to try and begin to find some journeys that have multi-interaction, So say, for example, here, you've got cross-network starts at the initial interaction, and then they come back through this website 5 times via organic search. And in this model that is chosen, organic will get 100% of those credits, and that would be equal to 2 conversions that happened where a user completed that journey. If I was to change my model to first click, then you could say that actually the cross network would get 100% of those conversions, and organic, even though it was the next 5 touch points, would receive 0 credit. So it's a great way for understanding how consumers, or how Google is defining which channel gets the credit under various scenarios, and it's great to understand how those channels work together. To summarize the key takeaways in this section before we move on to understanding the audiences a little bit more, I would sort of say that conversions in the platform now can consist of both modeled and observed to help gain visibility, or better visibility, for the end-to-end user to combat privacy out of users choosing to opt out of cookies. Google Analytics 4 does run on a data-driven attribution model, which means it distributes credit for the conversions based on the observed data available. The model comparison reports are a great opportunity to compare differences between the impact of different marketing activity. And then the conversion paths report is a fantastic way to gain a better understanding of how the channels work together to drive conversion and where credit would be attributed. Now we're going to head into audiences. Audiences are the group of your users who share the same attributes. You can share audiences with the advertising products that you use, for example, Google Ads, so that you can end up beginning to market to a specific group of users that you've collated together. If you head into settings, you can see a list of all of the audiences that exist, and then you can begin to click into these audiences to analyze them more. Google Analytics 4 also has some predictive elements to audiences, which allows you to create an audience list based on these predictive metrics. For example, in an e-commerce example, it might be users who are likely to purchase. So if we go into admin and go into audiences, you will see that there are audiences already in place, and anything with a little magic wand at the end are your predictive audiences. And then, for example, if we were to click into them, you get given a report that is all based on your user, on the audience that you've picked, and you can then change it from this drop down here. So for example, for any engaged audience, I can see currently in the last 28 days, there was 13,000 users in this pot, 22,000 engaged sessions, and 295,000 conversions. There's not many. You can see the app version, the platform, and the device category. You can't really do much more with it than that. But I think it's a great way to understand what that sort of pot looks like. And then if we were to go through how to create an audience, so we've just jumped into an account where I'd be able to create an audience. And when you go into audiences, you should see a blue button to create a new audience. When you press this, there's a few different options that you can do. So you can create one from scratch. You can look at some of the general ones that Google already kind of have pre-populated. So recent active users, non-purchasers, purchasers, lapsed customers, lapsed purchasers. There are also templates, so if you wanted to build one based on demographics, technology, or acquisition, you could do that there. And then there's also predictive ones, but again, a lot of these are mainly e-commerce based, and you can see, for example, you might not be eligible to use all of them or not, but in general, that sort of thing exists. But I'll just create a custom audience, and then you've got a range of things that you can do here. So first you want to give it a title. So just for ease, I'm just going to do one based on mobile users. You can include users when, and then I'm going to say device category contains mobile, and I'm going to apply that. And then what it'll tell me is how many users. You'll see on this side the amount of users that are in this audience. You can do various things like your condition scoping could be across all sessions, has to be within the same session or within the same event. You can begin to add a sequence, so they do this and then they do X, Y, or Z. You can also add users to exclude, and you could add more conditions into this audience as well. And then on the sequence, the other thing that is quite interesting, you can put a time constraint in there if required. So we'll just get rid of all of this for now. You can have a membership duration, so how long do you want them to stay in the membership? And then you can also add a trigger. So for example, if someone was to trigger this conversion, you could log an event when a member becomes this audience. So for example, if you think of some of the predicted audiences, you might know the lifetime value of your customers is £100, and therefore you might have an audience of users who are logged in who have a lifetime value of more than £100, and every time someone hits that pot, you might want to trigger a new event that says new high lifetime value customer. And then because that gives you an event, you can make that a conversion, and therefore you can begin to, say, optimize your Google Ads campaigns to high lifetime value customers, for example. So it's a great way of being able to do that. But it might just be that you want to trigger an event, like if you were saying someone who viewed your contact page but didn't submit your contact form, you might want to trigger an event for, say, like contact form abandons, and then you might want to optimize towards that conversion or remarket to that audience because they've left your website but haven't submitted your form. So basically that's what you'd do, and then you could save this audience, and again it says right now there's less than 10 users in this time frame, but you'd be able to go back to that time and time again. There's some key things to be aware of when you're thinking about audiences. So it can take up to 48 hours for an audience to gather data after it's been created. We have touched on the fact that you can create audience triggers. So for example, high lifetime value, or potentially like contact form abandons or something like that, or they downloaded your PDF but didn't watch your video or something. You can use various things that are more important to your business. And then once you have those as events, you can then begin to optimize towards them afterwards. There are a few different types of audiences that can be defined, so I think it's important to know the difference. So you've got scope audiences, which are just based on a set of conditions. So for example, they did this, they did that, they did X. You've got your static versus dynamic. So if it was ever true, then the dynamic includes users when they meet those criteria and exclude them when they no longer meet those criteria. For example, if you had engaged users, which had to be users that come to your website and read your new blog post every week, for example, they might be in a pot of highly engaged content users. However, if suddenly they stop coming to your website every week to view your blog content, then you might want to remove them from the highly engaged content users audience, for example. So that's how dynamic would work. You have time windowed. So for example, customers who are likely to purchase in X days, customers who haven't been back to the website in X months, etc. And then you've got sequences. So what order did you want someone to do something in? So first they viewed a product page, then they added it to their basket, then they went to checkout, and then they didn't purchase, for example. That's all of the different sort of types of audiences you can have. But the type of audience that you're building, I think it's usually to answer a specific business question or to give you a different level of approach to targeting in Google Ads as well. So just be aware of them, but you don't need to go crazy about it. And then to wrap this up, in terms of key takeaways from this section, audiences can be automatically created by Google Analytics 4, but you can also create new audiences that are actually based on your business needs. There are a lot of templates that you can use, or you can create your conditions from scratch, where you completely define the logic that you need to segment an audience. And also you've got the ability to create those new events based on a set of conditions using the audience trigger, which will be really useful from a conversion perspective to help align with business objectives and that wider business goal, especially if your business objective can't close the loop 100% digitally, then it would be really helpful from that perspective as well.